Okay, think about this for a second. Imagine a country so divided it actually goes to war with itself. Now, picture that same country, less than 100 years later, standing as the most powerful nation on Earth. That wild, chaotic, and incredible transformation is exactly what we're going to dig into. And right at the heart of this whole storm was one man, Abraham Lincoln. You see, his words here weren't just some fancy political speech. They were pretty much a prophecy. He saw, clear as day, that the nation just couldn't survive being two different things at once. And that set the stage for a conflict that would literally decide America's soul. So here's how we're going to break this story down. We're looking at 5 key moments: the nation being torn apart, then an age of incredible extremes, then a major pushback against all that power, a crushing depression, and a whole new deal, and finally, the jump from that crisis to becoming a global superpower. All right, let's start at the very beginning with the war that almost ended it all. First up, a nation torn apart. You know, before America could even dream of becoming a superpower, it had to figure out a much more basic question. Could it even continue to exist as a single country? And that question, well, it came to a head the moment Lincoln was elected in 1860. For the Southern states, a president who was against slavery spreading any further was the absolute last straw. That was it. They seceded, they formed the Confederacy, and the result was the American Civil War. This slide really gets right to the core of it all. You had 2 completely different visions for what the country's future should be. The Union in the North, they were fighting for one single indivisible nation. But the Confederacy in the South was fighting to be independent, with their entire economy and way of life built on the back of slavery. There was just no middle ground there. The 2 ideas just couldn't coexist. The human cost of this? I mean, it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. To this day, it's still the deadliest war in American history. But out of all that bloodshed, the United States we know today was forged. The Union was saved, and with the 13th Amendment, slavery was finally, officially, abolished. So the nation is painfully stitched back together. But now, a whole new challenge pops up. This explosion of industrial growth that was, well, as amazing as it was brutal. And this brings us to this idea of the Gilded Age. It's such a perfect name for the era, and it actually came from the writer Mark Twain. You know, when something is gilded, it has this thin, shiny layer of gold on the outside, but underneath, it's usually made of much cheaper stuff. That's exactly what this period was like. You really had 2 completely different Americas living side by side. On one hand, you've got these industrial titans, guys like Rockefeller and Carnegie, building these unbelievable empires in steel and oil. But on the other hand, you had millions of workers, many of them brand new immigrants, who were fueling this whole machine, working in dangerous factories for next to nothing. And people had a name for these new captains of industry: robber barons. And that term, it just perfectly captures this growing fear that these powerful men weren't just building the country, they were rigging the entire game in their own favor, crushing anyone and everyone who got in their way. I mean, something had to give, right? This massive gap between the rich and the poor sparked a really powerful reaction, a movement that demanded the government finally step in and rein in all this unchecked power. This question became the central debate of the early 20th century. A new reform movement called the Progressives started to gain steam, and their argument was simple. This old laissez-faire, hands-off approach from the government, it just wasn't working anymore. It was time for the government to actually step up and protect regular people. And the champion of this new way of thinking was President Theodore Roosevelt. His whole square deal idea was a complete game changer. For really the first time, you had a president using the full power of the government to take on monopolies, to protect consumers, to protect the environment, and even to side with workers against huge corporations. But the whole system was way more fragile than anybody really understood. That economic engine that had been roaring through the 1920s, well, it was about to completely fall apart. And that led to the country's next great test. So after all the highs of the roaring 20s, the bubble didn't just burst, it absolutely exploded. The Wall Street crash of 1929 was just a complete freefall. It started on Black Thursday, and by terrifying Tuesday, just a few days later, it was a full-blown financial meltdown. And the thing is, the crash was just the beginning. It kicked off the Great Depression, a decade of just unimaginable suffering. Businesses went bankrupt, farms failed, and by 1932, Millions and millions of Americans were unemployed and absolutely desperate. The response came from a new president, Franklin D. Roosevelt, who came in promising a New Deal. And this wasn't just one policy. It was a massive series of experiments, this whole alphabet soup of new agencies. But they were all designed to do three things: provide immediate relief for people who were suffering, spark an economic recovery, and reform the system, with huge programs like Social Security to make sure this could never happen again. Now, the New Deal, without a doubt, gave people hope. But it wasn't a magic wand. Unemployment stayed stubbornly high all through the 1930s. And that brings us to the final chapter of this whole transformation, and one of modern history's biggest debates. So, what was it that really pulled the country out of the Great Depression? Was it all of those bold new domestic programs from FDR? Or was it the eruption of an even bigger global crisis? And this slide kind of lays out the two sides of that argument. On the one hand, a lot of people credit the New Deal with saving the country, with building a social safety net that we still have today. But on the other hand, many historians argue that it was the massive, all-out industrial production needed for World War II that really put an end to the Depression, because it put literally everyone back to work. But at the end of the day, whatever you believe ended the Depression, the outcome of the war was undeniable. America's industrial power basically became the arsenal of democracy, fueling the Allied victory. By 1945, the very same nation that had been on its knees just a decade earlier now stood alone as the world's undisputed economic and military superpower. It's an incredible turnaround. So, from civil war to superpower, this 85-year journey forged modern America through this relentless cycle of crisis and reinvention. And what's the big takeaway here? It's that the huge debates from that time about inequality, about the role of government, about what it means to be an American, they never really went away. We're still living with them and arguing about them right now.